Christmas dinner at my father's house had always been a carefully orchestrated performance. The dining room gleamed with crystal glasses and silver candlesticks, everything positioned just so, like we were auditioning for a holiday magazine cover. The ham glistened under warm light, surrounded by perfect side dishes that filled the air with cinnamon and rosemary. On the surface, it looked like pure family bliss, but beneath the polished veneer, it was pure theater, and my sister Claire was always the leading lady. She sat beside Dad, radiating that effortless confidence that made everything look easy. Claire never had to work for attention. People gravitated toward her naturally, drawn by her laugh, her stories, her ability to make even mundane moments feel significant. And my father, Robert, well, he made sure the spotlight stayed locked on her like a stage light that never dimmed. His voice would change whenever he mentioned her name, becoming warmer, prouder, like he was announcing royalty. His stories always circled back to Claire's latest achievement. New promotion, perfect relationship, dream vacation. You'd think she'd discovered the cure for aging with the way he spoke about her accomplishments, and me? I was Emma, the reliable one, the one who remembered birthdays and helped with dishes, the one nobody ever thought to interview about their dreams or ambitions. I existed in the spaces between Claire's victories, filling the quiet moments when the attention needed somewhere. Safe to land. It always began the same way. Once the plates were loaded and the small talk exhausted itself, Robert would lean back in his chair with that familiar gleam in his eye, the one that meant he had an announcement brewing, a performance ready to unfold. He raised his wine glass, like a conductor's baton, preparing to direct the room's admiration toward his favorite subject. So, he said, drawing the word out like a drumroll, Claire just got the most incredible news. The partnership track at her firm, full benefits, corner office. It's the kind of opportunity that sets you up for life, you know? Real security, the room responded with predictable enthusiasm. My Aunt Susan gasped with delight. My cousin Michael nodded approvingly. Claire, naturally, didn't even glance up from cutting her ham. She just offered that perfectly modest smile she'd mastered over the years, the kind that whispered, "Oh, please stop, but definitely keep going." I took a careful sip of wine, not water this time. I needed something with more substance tonight. Then, right on schedule, Robert's gaze drifted toward me. I recognized the look before he even tilted his head, that mixture of concern and condescension. Wrapped in fatherly worry, "Sweetheart," he said, his voice taking on that soft, overly gentle tone that coated every syllable like honey over vinegar. "When are you going to find some real direction in your life?" There it was. The question I'd heard in a dozen different variations over the years, always dressed up as caring but laced with disappointment. It didn't matter how I responded. Anything short of a corporate title, a visible career ladder, and a life that looked like Claire's was just another confirmation of my lack of ambition. For years, I'd played my part perfectly. I smiled, deflected, gave vague answers about figuring things out or exploring options. I let it slide because making waves would only prove their point that I was the problem child who couldn't handle constructive criticism. But this year was different. Not because I had something to prove, but because I'd finally stopped caring whether they understood me. That shift wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was quiet, like the way you realize one morning that you've stopped checking your phone for messages from someone who never really listened to your voice anyway. So I looked up from my plate and met his eyes, calm and steady, wearing a smile that wasn't asking for permission or approval. I let the silence stretch, let it settle into the room. Like morning fog, Robert's question hung in the air, delicate but heavy, waiting for me to respond the way I always had, with polite deflection, gentle self-deprecation, or acknowledgement of their version of what success should look like. But this time, I was finished. With that script, I reached for my wine glass, slow and deliberate, letting it rest in my hand for a moment before taking a measured sip. It was just long enough to make Claire shift slightly in her seat, just long enough for Robert to glance, toward her, expecting some clever joke to diffuse whatever tension he sensed building. Just long enough for everyone to realize I wasn't going to smooth this over with familiar self-doubt. I set the glass down gently, then looked straight at my father with that same calm smile. "Oh," I said, my voice even and clear. "I already found it." Robert blinked. "Found what?" "Direction," I said, still smiling. "I just didn't think you'd understand it." His fork paused halfway to his mouth, creating a soft clink against the plate that seemed to echo longer than it should have. No one spoke. Not Aunt Susan, not Michael, not even Claire. They all stared at me like I'd just spoken in a foreign language or violated some unspoken rule about staying in character. Robert's mouth opened slightly, his eyebrows drawing together in confusion, as if the very idea that I had a life he didn't know about was not just surprising, but somehow personally offensive. I didn't look away. I let him sit with it, with all the assumptions that had just started cracking like ice under spring sun, with the quiet message behind my words. "You never really saw me, and I stopped waiting for you to, and that was just the beginning." I didn't rush to fill the silence. I let it do the work that raised voices never could. Sometimes stillness carries more weight than any argument, and tonight it was doing exactly that. The quiet stretched between us like a bridge none of them knew how to cross. Aunt Susan was the first to move, reaching for the cranberry sauce like her hands needed something to occupy them. But even then, she kept stealing glances in my direction, trying to reconcile the Emma she thought she knew with the one sitting across from her. Robert cleared his throat. "So what kind of direction are we talking about?" His voice had changed. Now, no longer dripping with condescension, just thin and cautious. He was trying to regain his footing, to remind the table that he still had the authority to ask the probing questions. I gave a small shrug, reaching for the dinner rolls. "The profitable kind," I said simply. "Though I suppose that depends on how you define profit." The way the room leaned forward at that answer was almost amusing. Not just curiosity now, but hunger for details, for context, for the control they'd never bothered to seek before. It was the kind of focused attention I hadn't received at that table in years, maybe ever. Claire's smile flickered at the edges. "Profitable," she repeated with forced casualness. "What kind of work are you doing exactly?" I didn't answer immediately. I took my time buttering my roll, letting them sit in the unfamiliar space of not knowing everything about my life. Then, still calm, still perfectly unbothered, I said, "The kind that doesn't require anyone else's approval." That was when the energy in the room shifted for good. Michael let out a soft whistle. Susan blinked hard. Robert's hand tensed around his fork. Even Claire leaned back slightly, her jaw tightening as she processed what I'd just said. It wasn't a boast. I didn't deliver it like it was meant to impress them. I said it like it was ordinary, like it was just a fact of my existence. And that, more than any number or title, was what unsettled them. Robert forced a smile. "Well, that sounds very independent," he said. "But don't you think it's important to have some structure? Some accountability?" There it was, the subtle redirect, the instinct to reframe my words, to remind me that success without their understanding or approval didn't really count as success at all. I looked at him and gave a slow, easy nod. "Maybe," I said, "but I prefer accountability to results rather than opinions." His face twitched. Claire's hand tightened around her glass. And just like that, the story they'd all been telling themselves about me began to unravel. Robert tried to maintain his composure, but I could see the small signs of strain. The tightness around his eyes, the way his shoulders had gone rigid, the barely perceptible pause before he found his voice again. "How long have you been doing this work?" he asked. There was something underneath his tone now, not just curiosity but something more brittle, too careful, like someone trying not to show how far behind they felt in a conversation they thought they were leading. "About 3 years, I said. "That did it." His eyes flicked toward Claire. Her confident expression faltered just enough to show the crack underneath. She covered it with a sip of wine, but her grip on the glass was rigid. 3 years, and they hadn't known a thing. No congratulations, no questions, no interest in what I was building. I'd created something entirely my own, and they had missed it because they never thought to look beyond their assumptions about who I was supposed to be. Robert tried again. Why didn't you tell us? His voice wasn't sharp this time. It was softer, but not warm-wounded, and that was new territory for him. I tilted my head slightly, as if I needed a moment to consider the question. I didn't. I guess it never seemed relevant, I said. It's not like anyone ever asked what I was working on. She had no comeback, no easy deflection. Claire let out a short laugh. Come on, Emma, she said, shaking her head. A career is a pretty big deal. Kind of strange to keep it a secret, don't you think? I met her gaze calmly. Not really, I said. It's not like anyone seemed interested in what I was doing anyway. Claire sat forward slightly, elbows resting on the edge of the table like she was preparing to re-establish her position as the family success story. What kind of business did you even start? She asked. Her tone was casual on the surface, but there was something underneath it, something forced. Like she was already trying to shape the narrative before the details arrived. I knew exactly what she was doing. I'd watched it for years. Minimize, redirect, dismiss. Make it smaller than it was so it wouldn't threaten the established order. I didn't give her the satisfaction of rushing my answer. I picked up my wine glass, swirled it slowly, took a quiet sip. Then I looked directly at her. Oh, I said, like it had just occurred to me. The kind that makes more than yours. The silence that followed was immediate and complete. Not shocked, not offended, just still. Like the room needed a moment to absorb what had just been said and recalibrate everything they thought they knew. Claire's smile flickered again, just a twitch at the corner, but her fingers tightened around her glass. Her jaw tensed. She didn't like being on the defensive. Not here, not in front of Robert, not at this table where for so long she'd been the untouchable golden child. Robert blinked rapidly. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. No clever deflection, no protective praise for Claire, just confusion, and Susan, ever curious, leaned in. Makes more, she asked. How much more are we talking? I didn't answer right away. I let them want it. Let them sit in the unfamiliar space of me having information they needed instead of the other way around. Finally, I said lightly, about 4 times more. The quiet gasp from Susan was almost comical. Robert's breath caught, and Claire didn't say a word, but she didn't have to. Her silence said everything. Robert tried to recover. He clasped his hands together on the table, sat up straighter, and forced a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Well, Claire's position is very stable, he said brightly, his voice just a little too loud, and the benefits are excellent. Security matters more than just income. Claire exhaled through her nose and sat taller, clearly grateful for the assist. Yeah, she said. You know, there's something to be said for consistency, steady growth. Aunt Susan tilted her head. Wait, she said, setting down her fork. Emma, do you mean you're making 4 times what Claire makes at her law firm? The question hit harder than she intended. It sliced through Robert's protective narrative with surgical precision. Claire paused, just a fraction of a second, but it was long enough. Well, income isn't everything, she said. There's job security, benefits, professional development. I gave a soft hum, nodding slowly. That's true, I said. Some of us just prefer not to need those things. Claire didn't respond. Her jaw clenched. Her knuckles were white against the base of her wine glass, and I knew I'd just touched a nerve. That went deeper than money. For the first time, the golden child didn't look so golden. I leaned back in my chair, let my fingers graze the rim of my plate, and turned my attention toward her. So, I said gently, how's that partnership track working out for you, Claire? Her mouth twitched. It was barely visible, but it was there. Robert looked between us, clearly sensing the tension but not yet understanding where it was headed. Claire's doing excellently, he said quickly. She's always been responsible. She's always made smart choices. I tilted my head. Has she? Claire's eyes narrowed. What's that supposed to mean? You like to talk about professional development, I said evenly. You like to act like you've got it all figured out. But the truth is, you're not really on any partnership track, are you? She froze, and for a split second, I saw something I'd never seen in her before. Genuine fear. What? Robert said, looking sharply at her. What is she talking about? I didn't blink. Did you tell him, Claire? I asked, voice soft but steady. That your firm is downsizing? That they've been letting associates go for months? That you're actually on thin ice because your billable hours have been slipping? The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Robert looked at Claire like he was seeing a stranger. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. You're lying, she said finally, flat and desperate. You don't know what you're talking about. I leaned forward, rested my elbows lightly on the table. If I'm lying, I said, then why haven't you been working the late nights you used to mention? Why have you been home every evening for the past 2 months? Why did you ask me for a loan last spring? She didn't move, didn't speak. And that was all the confirmation anyone needed. Robert's napkin crumpled between his fingers. Claire, he whispered. Tell me she's wrong, she laughed. It was sharp, brittle, the kind of sound that collapses in on itself. She's just trying to cause drama, she said, waving a dismissive hand. She doesn't know what she's talking about. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. If I'm wrong, I said, then show him your last performance review, your client list, your billing records. That was all. No yelling, no accusations, just calm, measured words. And it devastated her more than shouting ever could. Claire's jaw tightened so hard I could see the muscle jumping beneath her skin. Robert looked at her, really looked, maybe for the first time in years. The certainty in his face was gone, replaced by something heavier. Doubt. Show me, he said, quietly. Claire, show me. She opened her mouth, closed it. Her hand ran through her hair, and suddenly she didn't look composed or successful. She looked like a child caught in a lie too big to fix. Finally, her voice came out small and cornered. Fine, she muttered. I'm on probation. The breath left Robert's lungs in a slow, audible exhale. Probation, he repeated, barely getting the word out. It's not that serious, she rushed. It's temporary. I just had a few difficult clients. I'm working on it, but it didn't matter what she said. The spell had broken. For years he had held her up like a trophy, like everything she touched turned to gold. And now, in the same room where he'd spent decades praising her achievements, the truth sat between them like an uninvited guest. You let me tell everyone about your partnership track, Robert said, his voice trembling. You let me believe I didn't ask you to, she cut in, voice harsh. But it was too late. The image he'd wrapped his identity around, Claire the success, Claire the example, was shattered, and everyone at that table could see the pieces. I sat still. No need to twist the knife. It had already sunk deep enough. For the first time in my life, Robert didn't know what to say. And Claire looked like someone who'd built her entire identity on other people's admiration and just watched it crumble. The silence after her confession wasn't uncomfortable. It was revelatory. Michael sat back, eyes wide. Aunt Susan stared at her plate like she couldn't remember how she'd gotten there. Even the candles seemed to flicker differently in the changed atmosphere. Claire's leg bounced under the table, nervous energy with nowhere to go. She looked like someone who had counted on one thing all her life, that no matter what happened, Robert would be in her corner, defending her, propping her up. But he wasn't speaking. He just stared at her, quiet and still, his hands folded in his lap like even they had given up. She turned to me. You think you've accomplished something here? She snapped. You really needed to humiliate me at Christmas dinner? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't humiliate you, I said evenly. You did that all by yourself. Her nostrils flared, her jaw tightened again, but this time she had no comeback, no clever retort, just shallow breathing and defensive posture. I looked at Robert. You never asked about my work, my goals, my plans, I said, my voice calm but undeniable. You assumed if I wasn't like Claire, I was failing, but I didn't fail. I just stopped performing for an audience that never really saw me. His lips parted, slightly, maybe to protest, but no words came out. For a long time, I'd told myself his favoritism didn't hurt, that I was above caring about his approval. But now, watching his face shift under the weight of reality, I realized something else. I had never needed his pride. I had only needed his honesty, and that was finally starting to surface. Claire stood abruptly, her chair scraping back hard against the floor. I'm done, she muttered. I don't need to sit here and be attacked. Funny, I said, folding my napkin carefully. That's what I've been doing for years. She didn't answer. She just walked away, her heels clicking sharp against the hardwood floor. The sound of the front door slamming behind her was the loudest thing in the house. When it was over, Robert still hadn't moved, but something in the room had shifted. And this time, the change felt permanent. I didn't speak right away. I let the silence do its work. Robert sat motionless, his fingers laced tightly in his lap. His eyes hadn't moved from the doorway where Claire had disappeared, but his expression had changed completely. No longer proud, no longer certain, just lost. For once, the person left in the room with him wasn't the one who needed explaining. You always assumed I was the one without direction, I said quietly. You never wondered if maybe I was just going somewhere you couldn't see. His gaze shifted to me then, slowly, like he wasn't sure he was ready to meet my eyes, but he did. Do you really think I never cared about you? He asked, and there was something different in his voice now, thin and almost fragile. I think you cared about the version of me that made sense to you, I answered. The one who didn't challenge your understanding of success. The one who let you measure everything in terms of traditional careers and conventional achievements. He blinked once, twice, then looked down at his hands. Aunt Susan cleared her throat. Emma, she said gently, why didn't you tell anyone what you were building? I smiled, not bitter, not triumphant, just honest. Because none of you ever asked. Not really. They'd asked about holidays, about my health, about surface-level things, but never about the late nights I'd spent developing my consulting business, never about the risks I'd taken or the victories they never witnessed. They hadn't even noticed when I'd started traveling for work or when I'd stopped asking them for financial advice. They just assumed I was drifting aimlessly through life. Robert looked at me again, and this time I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Not regret exactly, but recognition. Maybe for the first time, he wasn't seeing me through the lens of comparison to Claire. Maybe now he was seeing the woman who'd quietly built something substantial and didn't need his validation. To make it real, I stood up slowly. No drama, no theatrical exit, just the quiet scrape of my chair and the weight of every family gathering falling away behind me. I reached for my purse, slid the strap over my shoulder, adjusted my coat with a calmness I hadn't felt in this house for years. No one spoke. Robert didn't stop me. He didn't ask me to stay. He didn't try to salvage whatever remained of our relationship. And maybe that was the most honest thing he'd done all evening. I looked around the room one last time. Claire's empty chair sat like a period at the end of a long sentence. Aunt Susan stared down at her plate, hands folded tight. Michael looked at me with something like respect, as if he was seeing me clearly for the first time. I turned to Robert. His eyes were glassy, his lips parted, but he said nothing, just watched me as if he expected some final blow, some cruel remark, some triumphant declaration, but I didn't need that. I hadn't left to hurt anyone. I left because I finally didn't owe anyone here an explanation for who I'd become. Next time you want to understand my life, I said, voice steady and low, without any edge, maybe try asking about it instead of assuming. And with that, I opened the front door. The cold winter air met my face, crisp and clean, carrying the scent of snow and possibility. A world outside this dining room where I wasn't anyone's disappointment or surprise or puzzle to solve. Just me. I stepped out into it. No applause, no gasps, no final words trailing after me. Just peace. The kind that doesn't come from proving anything to anyone, but from finally knowing your own worth.